Hi, everyone. I have Dr. Georgia Purdom with us today. She is an author at Master Books, and one of her great newest books is Crafted by God from Fertilization to Birth. This is an excellent resource to help children understand that God created life and when it begins. And she is going to talk to us about the important things that your children need to know about DNA and the biblical worldview of DNA. Welcome, Dr. Purdom.
Well, thanks for having me. It's great to be here. As a trained geneticist, I love DNA Day. I'm all about that. So, day to celebrate such a wonderful thing that God has created and really every living thing that is on this planet, right? There's something that we share even with bacteria, the fact that we have DNA. And, it's really important to teach our children about this because it's one of the ways, even though every living thing has DNA, whether it's a bacteria, an animal, a plant, a human being, all of that DNA is truly unique. And even among humans, right? Even though we share a lot of similarities with each other, our DNA is absolutely 100% in that sense unique, right? No other person on the planet has the same DNA as we do. Now, identical twins will share the same DNA sequence, all right? But even then there can be differences in identical twins because of how that DNA is actually sort of regulated or expressed. And so they'll even have some differences. I know a set of identical twins, one is taller than the other. Even though they're identical twins and they have the same DNA information, it's read a little bit different, so to speak, or interpreted a little differently. And so they have uniqueness because of that, even though they have the same DNA.
That's fascinating.
So I think yeah, it really is. And it's really important to teach our kids that we are unique human beings that have been created by God and to bear God's image in the world. And so we do that in lots of different ways. Even though we're all unique, we're all image bearers of God. And we share certain attributes with God, and we want to be able to share those things with the world in the way that we communicate with each other, love each other, create, design, learn. All of those things are ways that we bear God's image in the world around us. And we do that in unique ways. Just like our DNA is unique, we're doing that uniquely as human beings created in his image. And, another thing that it does is because one of the things that's really pushed on children of all ages is the idea of evolution, that we evolved from some sort of single celled common ancestor over billions of years. And that our closest ancestor, so to speak, is the chimp, that we have a common ancestor with chimps. About 6 million years ago, we broke off, so to speak, and humans became humans and chimps, went on to become chimps, but we have that common ancestry. And that's something you see a lot in children's books, children's programming. But when we actually look at the DNA, that's one of the ways that we can tell that there is no way that evolutionary story, which is all it is, it's just a story, can be true because there's too many differences in the DNA for us to be evolutionarily related. You see it on zoo signs. I mean, you go to the zoo, that's where you'll see it a lot. Oh, look, this is our, we shared a common ancestor with the chimps, just a few million years ago. Can't you see how similar we are? And I'm like, no, we're not, though. If you, besides looking at things like our anatomy, so to speak, you can tell we are really different, but also at our DNA. And they'll say on the sign, usually, our DNA, human and chimp DNA is 98 to 99% the same. And I'm like, no, it isn't. If you really count all the differences between human and chimp, the most similarity that I've seen is maybe 20% similarity. So we're more like, 20% differences. So we're more like only 80% similar. And that's really just looking at the sequence of the DNA. We have to remember DNA is a three-dimensional structure. And so there's all these like layers of information. And if you start looking at all the different layers, you start to see even more differences, right? And how that DNA is regulated, how that DNA is expressed is very different between chimps and humans. So it's just a falsehood, right? That idea that human and chimp DNA is so similar, and somehow that gives credence to the evolutionary story. The other thing, something else I help children understand is that the sequencing of the human genome, when we finally sequenced all of the DNA that we have, it really confirmed that we're all one race, right? And these are things that we teach in the book, that we have, that crafted by God, because we really want children to understand that we don't have a common ancestor with the chimps, that we are all one race. So regardless of our skin tone or eye shape or any of those things, that we all come from two people just about 6,000 years ago. And even though we're all unique, we all have a lot of similarities in our DNA. I think any two humans, doesn't matter what ethnicity they come from, because there's no such thing as races, right, of people. There's just different people groups or different ethnicities. We're only about 0.4% different. 0.4. That's not very much. Yeah, and that's only really possible if we came from two people just a few thousand years ago. Because in the evolutionary timeline, there's a lot more time, right? There's hundreds of thousands of years since we have quote unquote modern humans coming into existence. And if that's the case, we should have a lot more differences in our DNA, and we just don't. So it's showing that we're coming from just these two people, that God created with genetic diversity. And we do see that in human beings today with different skin tones and different eye shapes and things, but not lots of differences, which you would expect if you had a lot more time. And so again, it's one of those things that really confirms that biblical account of creation. And something else that we talk about in the book too, and we talk about children that have disabilities. And that's because sometimes that's because there are mutations in their DNA, right? There's something wrong with the DNA, and that's because of the fall, right? Because Adam and Eve sinned, and because we all descend from them, we're all sinners, and that has obviously spiritual repercussions, that separates us from God, that sin, but it also has physical repercussions where we have changes in the DNA. And because of that, sometimes people have disabilities. Like we have things like Down syndrome, which children might be very familiar with because it's very visible, so to speak, on the outside. They have an extra chromosome 21 and that results in the Down syndrome. But those children are still made in the image of God, right? They can reflect God's image even though they may not be exactly like us, so to speak. They, in that disability, can still very much reflect the image of God. I have so my co-author of this book, Stacia McKeever, she has a son that has Williams syndrome. And in that case, they're missing a portion of chromosome 7. So they're missing some of their DNA. But Kieran, who's pictured in this book, is one of the most outgoing, friendly people you would ever want to meet. He does not know strangers, right? He likes to talk with people, engage with people. He shares the gospel with people. And wow, what a great quality to have, and really being able to show again the image of God and be able to express that in his way, even through his disability. And so I think it's helping children really see that even though, again, we live in a fallen world, and even though some people do have differences, right, differences in their abilities, it doesn't make them any less image bearers, right? And again, that's something that in our culture, we talk a little bit in the book about abortion, but even with euthanasia and all of these things, well, people, if they can't they can't do certain things, or they can't contribute to the economy or whatever, then we need to do away with those people, right? They're less valuable. And we want children to know that they are valuable, not based on their DNA sequence, right? They're valuable because they're made in the image of God. And that's true for every single human being, from the moment of fertilization, the moment that egg and sperm meet, to their death, right? And so we want children to really embrace that, regardless of level of development, level of ability or disability, or what their DNA sequence is. It doesn't matter, because we're all made in the image of God and truly unique, and to bear that image uniquely. So I think that those are some of the important concepts. While DNA Day, you might think, oh, that's kind of what would that have to do with me, right? I know DNA exists, but how can I use that to teach my children about the importance of that? And I think there's several different ways to do that. And like I say, the book, we really wanted to highlight some of those ways in there that relate directly to DNA. So it's a great resource to use with your kids to be able to help them do that and kind of tie that in. It's always fun to do something different for the day. So maybe be able to tie that in for DNA.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Well, hello, Dr. Jeanson. Thank you so much for being with us today. We have a great opportunity to talk about the biblical worldview of DNA, and you are an author who knows all about it. So I want you to tell us a little bit about your work, your research, your books, and then explain what phenomenal discoveries you've made regarding DNA and people groups.
Yeah, so I've been working on DNA for about 15 years, both at the Institute for Creation Research and at Answers in Genesis. I started off on working on the general question of the origin of species, using DNA to try to understand the answers to that question better. How do they form? When do they form? What were the mechanisms by which they formed? Maybe even get at some questions of why they went extinct, and so on. And in the last about 7 to 10 years, I focused very intensely on the question of human origins, in part because the annual research budget of the National Institutes of Health was $45 billion. So there's massive amounts of human genetic data out there. We're probably the best studied species at the genetic level, aside from maybe E. coli. So lots of data to understand what makes us human. And what's been of great interest to me is what about our history is contained in our DNA. And that's been a tremendous amount of fun to discover new answers to those questions and discover answers to questions we've not had answers to for centuries, if not thousands of years.
Sure. So the book you and I worked on a couple of years ago is Traced. I'd like for you to tell us just a little bit about what you have to offer the families that are listening to in Traced, the magnitude of what you've found there, and then we'll go through some people groups.
Yes, that book came about because now it's about literally 10 years ago, I was working on the human origins question. I was working with a particular type of DNA in which we had found good evidence for humanity only being 6,000 years old, evidence seemingly consistent with the flood and the anthropology that the Bible lays out in Genesis 6 through 10, both before and after the flood, with Noah and his family. And the next major biblical event in my mind was the Tower of Babel. So I thought, could we find the genetic echo of that, number one? And I had a contact who was a linguist. He was with the academic arm, I think, of Wycliffe or Tyndale, one of the Bible translating groups. And I thought, could we overlay the genetic map of humanity with the linguistic map of humanity? Naturally, Babel being a language event primarily, one that will have profound genetic consequences. And in retrospect, the answer is kind of obvious if you think about it. You can change your language, you can't change your DNA. So there's plenty of areas in the globe where the DNA and the languages do not overlap. For example, in the Americas, African Americans are unambiguously tied back to Africa by their DNA, but they speak Indo-European languages. English if you're in the United States, Spanish if you're in most of the rest of Latin America, Portuguese if you're in Brazil. So that's one example. But in areas of the globe that have been isolated, like Papua New Guinea or parts of China or anywhere, other places on the globe, you do find overlap, ancient DNA lineages, as well as clear examples of linguistic isolation. And that really spawned then what's become a 10-year process of trying to understand what DNA tells us. And in fact, I had to sort of reverse my whole process, my whole approach to this. I was initially looking for Babel. That was the motivation. But in working with the linguist, it became clear both in language and in DNA, and of course, when you go back and look at scripture, Babel is really the start of the process post-flood, not the end of it. So Babel is followed by 4,000 years of migration, conquest, rape, pillage, slaughter, all sorts of ugly things humans do the world over. And instead of looking for Babel first, I realized, no, we need to go look, sort of start in the present and work our way backwards through the sequence of migrations and conquests and so forth, which was great fun and very apologetically relevant, because that's really one of the strongest evidences of humanity being young. Without going into a lot of technical detail, if we go back to Noah, the history of civilization is post-flood history. For evolution, the history of civilization is just the tiny tail end of a very long process of evolution. And you almost wouldn't expect to see the DNA signatures of the Egyptian Empire, of the Roman Empire, of the Greek Empire, of Alexander the Great, and so on. Whereas if the Bible's true, which I believe it is, then you would see that. And the book Trace, then I wrote in 2000, we published in 2022, is a book-length treatment of the answer to that question. Do we see human history stamped all over our DNA, which if we only go back 4,500 years, then we should see it. The answer, of course, is yes, we do. In fact, I was able to go full circle. So I ended up going 10 years ago from female inherited DNA to the book now male inherited DNA. This was a very helpful switch, because in Genesis 10, we have a male genealogy. Noah has 3 sons. His sons have many boys. That's what's recorded. You can see a mirror image of this at the base of the male inherited DNA family tree. That's what we also published in Trace. So there's multiple points of value for many readers, I think. One is on many, for lack of a better term, many points, many issues, many questions, we have a strong biblical confirmation from, again, a spitting image of the Genesis 10 family tree, to the history of civilization stamped all over our DNA, to answers to basic questions like, what happened to the Egyptians when their civilization was politically overthrown? What happened to the ancient Romans when their civilization was overthrown? So I grew up homeschooled in Christian school, and I feel like had a good education, learned about the politics, the cultures of these ancient peoples, as we should. But I didn't learn about the question of the who. Who did they come from? And then what happened to them after the civilizations fell? The reason I can say now, confidently in retrospect, was because no one had the answers to these questions. You have to have DNA to answer these questions. And I can say with scientific, I think, objectivity, you need the biblical framework as the basis for doing your DNA analysis to find the answers, which we now have. And so it's not just that creation science is answering skeptical questions from the evolutionary community. Creation science is contributing new answers to our knowledge about the world in general. Creation scientists are taking the lead and surpassing what evolution is able to do and putting them on the defensive.
You talked to me a little earlier about some points people groups you wanted to bring out. So I know you've mentioned some of them already, and I don't want to ask you to redo them, but I know one Native Americans is one that you wanted to talk about, and you have a new book coming out about that.
Yes, and this is where there's a personal angle to the book Trace. So it's not just an academic question, which I'm a nerd, so I like academic questions, but there's a personal, who do I come from? And whether you're Native American, African American, European American, Indian American, this book is global in its scope to answer all these questions. And what's so fun or surprising or wild or whatever adjective you want to use is, with the biblical framework and these genetic tools, we can take someone's DNA in the present and trace it all the way back in time, yes, to specific sons of Noah, but also figure out the in-between part. And that's where everyone's story gets so wild and complicated and unexpected. So I guess to give an example of what may have been my default position before having done this research, my last name is Jeanson. I'm told it's French origin. And my mother is German. So there's sort of this Germanic barbarian background you might expect in my family tree. And for many people of, I guess, Western European descent, or anyone of European descent, you think about, who do I come from? Well, maybe it's these Germanic peoples, even the English peoples have this connection to mainland Europe, if you look historically and such. So what's one of the surprises from this book, from this research, is how much more complex and volatile and nuanced all this is. Native Americans being one of the most surprising examples. In mainstream science, the explanation for Native American origins, obviously with evolution and an old Earth timescale, ultimately everyone goes back to primates, the evolutionists would say. But more immediately, they'd say humanity evolved out of Africa 200,000 years ago, again, long before civilization ever starts, and eventually made it to the Americas 15,000 years ago. Still, not millions, but thousands of years before any sort of civilization. And the perspective within the mainstream community is single settling, and then they call it prehistory, no written records, and very little insights into what actually went down before the Pilgrims first landed in what's now Massachusetts. And I think that's one of the reasons I grew up learning next to nothing about the pre-Columbian Americas, and I think most Americans have the same experience, because there aren't many good answers. It's then up to archaeology, which is, it can be ambiguous. No indigenous histories are really called upon to try to fill in the blanks. We don't have any names. It's very different from, for example, history of Western civilization. I took a class called World History in high school and realized later, of course, this is essentially the history of Western civilization: Babylon, Assyria, Egypt, Greece, Rome, Europe, and of course, colonialism and such after that. And basically nothing about Native Americans. But for Europe, we learn this was the King of England, this was the King of France, and this is the battle that he fought, and this is the empire that he ruled over, and this is the dates and the beginning and the end. None of that for Native American history. What's been so exciting with this biblically based research is it transforms all of that in so many ways that I never anticipated. So not just names and places, but we can get now a play-by-play of what happened. And the details of the play-by-play are what's so surprising. We now have evidence. So what I show in Traced is there were at least 3 settlings of the Americas from Asia. So evolutionists and creationists both say yes, from Asia. But when and how many times, that's where there's sort of a shocking difference. The most recent migration is about the 900s AD and gave rise to people the Pilgrims encountered. So they ran into, on the coast there in Massachusetts, the Narragansett, the Massachusetts, and others who are part of the technical term for the language family would be the Algic language family, or the Algonquins are a subgroup of them. Delawares are part of this group, the Cheyenne, the Blackfeet, other more familiar names. They have a very recent origin. And so there we go. There's the cover of my more recent book here. They Had Names, which is just going to be coming out in mid-May, where I detail some more of this. They didn't arrive in Massachusetts until maybe a century or two before the Pilgrims did, which is kind of wild. And again, we grew up learning all sorts of detail about the Pilgrims. The first Thanksgiving, I could have told you the backstory of the Pilgrims. Why did they leave Europe? Because of religious persecution. Who preceded them in Europe? All that. And then, of course, you get to the people they encountered, and then it's just a big question mark. Not anymore. Now we have the answers. Now we have the tools to investigate this because of the biblical framework, because of new genetic data. And one of the biggest surprises is this new genetic data has confirmed what the peoples themselves have said about their own origins. So I can say with more confidence, when the Massachusetts, the Narragansett, and others arrived in Massachusetts, because they have a history. They say, we came from here, then this guy was in charge, and this is what happened. And we have names as well for their leaders. So now this elevates pre-European history in the Americas to something like European history. I can say this was the name of the guy who was in charge, and this is who he fought, and this is when the empire fell, and so on. So that's been one of the biggest and most exciting surprises from Traced. That's kind of where the story starts, and I've continued it now, given its own book with a lot more detail, and They Had Names, tracing the pre-European history of North America. And this has led to relationships and opportunities I never would have anticipated. So, for example, in December 2023, I was at the Lakota Treaty Council Conference, invited to speak, and I learned the hard way. People like me, Caucasians, don't contact Native Americans. You have to wait for them to contact you, or they'll hang up the phone on you, which I learned literally the hard way when I tried cold calling reservations to tell about the research I'm doing.
Oh
So they
my.
saw some of the videos we were doing, contacted me, would you come speak? It was an event, clearly not a Christian event, very traditional. They're very proud of their traditional heritage. It's still a very indigenous worldview.
Mm-hmm.
Many comments that were anti-colonial, maybe anti-Caucasian, anti-Christian from the front. Yet I was there as an invited speaker. Again, normally we would have nothing to do with each other, but I'm there because it's the Young Earth framework that is confirming their own histories. The evolutionary community is not doing this, and that's why. That's what the answer I gave myself. That must have been why they invited me to come speak. So it's not just opening up answers to and windows to the past that young Earth creationists haven't had, that no one's had. It's now getting the attention of folks who've normally been outside the young Earth community and creating opportunities to get the message out and to put creationists in the lead.
That's phenomenal. Just look what the Lord has done, how he's bringing all these things together to reveal himself, to
Amen.
reveal, his master designer, creator, sovereign over history, sovereign over science, all of those things. Thank you so much for applying all that he put in you towards this. That's really amazing. Are there other people groups you want to mention while we are talking about this?
One of the favorite groups to study for me, or maybe most satisfying, has been the African American history. And I've run into a number of African Americans who've done way more genealogical work on their family tree than I ever had. My dad did some, and we got to maybe great grandma on one small branch, but not very far. And I've run into African Americans who can say, I can go back to my ancestors at this plantation in the 1800s, and I'm very impressed. What this research allows us to do is to take it then back across the Atlantic, ugly history of the transatlantic slave trade. But now we can say, and here's the rest of your story. This is the group you came from. This is what happened in the intervening couple thousand years in sub-Saharan Africa. And maybe what's the wildest part is nearly all of sub-Saharan Africa ultimately traces back to Northeast Africa, Ethiopia, probably Cush, son of Ham, and Egypt. And there were Nubian pharaohs on the throne of Egypt. And so I think you can state with a fair amount of confidence there is a royal heritage for most of sub-Saharan Africa because of this link back to, which we can see genetically, back to the peoples of Northeast Africa, Ethiopia. And again, there was a direct link between Ethiopia and Egypt back in the day in the last millennium BC. These are the types of stories we can now uncover and fill in more of the blanks for each individual's history and of their ancestors.
So this will have a huge impact on race relations or reconciliation or just knowing who you are, where you came from, so that you can fight off what you've described earlier as the evil of the world that wants to give you a very different view of yourself, not as a created being, wanted, chosen by the creator, given life and unique qualities, but how the world has caused us to look at certain people groups as greater, lesser, not important, more important. And so I'm thrilled at what you've done with your research and that we get a chance to publish it.
Yes, and for European Americans, on the topic of race, again, I give my last name, my mother's background. I think I go back to the Germanics. Well, most Europeans, by their male inherited DNA, the Y chromosome, go back to Central Asia within the last 1,000 years. So my ancestors 1,000 years ago in the Middle Ages and the Viking period likely looked more Chinese than Greek. And that's true for the majority of both people of Western European and Eastern European descent. One of the surprises of this research, I think the cause is likely you had a Black Death that wiped out perhaps up to 50% of Europe's population in the 1300s. That kind of resets things. And then whoever comes in and reproduces the most, and there's documented migrations from Central Asia in the Middle Ages into Europe. The Black Death resets things. Whoever reproduces the most ends up being the dominant lineage. And it just so happens it's Central Asian. So that kind of makes you stop and say, oh, I guess I thought there was a link to the Germanics, which there might be. Everyone's family tree is complicated, but the dominant genetic signal goes to a place that never would have entered my mind, just reflecting on my last name and the country of origin for my mother.
Wow. Well, I know the people listening must be so excited to learn more about who they are because of the research that you've done and just to understand God's world better. Thank you again for celebrating National DNA Day with us and for your research. And we look forward to a next generation that has way more biblical worldview on this topic.
Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Rivera, for being with me today to celebrate National DNA Day. I'm excited for everyone to learn about your resources. Master Books families know about you because you have so many things that relate to DNA and science and homeschool curriculum, but we want to just focus in on the DNA and the biblical worldview of DNA and how essential that is. So I'd love for you to tell us just about the wonder of God in DNA.
Yeah, so when we look at DNA, what we see is order and complexity. And when we see order and complexity, that requires intelligence. We've never seen a computer program that didn't have a programmer. We've never seen a book that didn't have an author. So when we see this complex code that can be understood for organized information, that tells us there has to be an author and designer behind that. And when we look at the complexity of DNA, I think it's one of the greatest confirmations we have that there must be the creator God as described in the Bible.
I love that. And I love that we get to do this. I love that we get to tell people just how glorious God is in the details. And the DNA is surely one of those details that somebody has to talk about,
Yes.
Otherwise we just forget. And we have all this stuff in the world that gives us different information, not biblical information. And so I'm excited for you to talk to us about the biblical worldview of DNA, how essential it is, the code, all those things.
Sure. So when we take a look at DNA through a biblical worldview, I always like to start, in Genesis. And what we see is that DNA is inside all living things, right? That has been confirmed. There's been in-depth studies into DNA and trying to what we call sequence the human genome, as well as now they're sequencing all kinds of animals and insects as well and plants. So when we take a look at living things and understanding there is species-specific DNA inside every cell of living things, or I say nucleated cells of living things, then creation is confirmation of what we see in Romans 1:20. The Bible tells us, for his invisible attributes, and namely his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world in the things that have been made. So they are without excuse. So when we start with this biblical worldview, we can see in Genesis that God created plants on day 3. And so we know plant DNA is just spoken into existence, the most complex language we don't even completely understand yet. But the creator God does, right? And on day 5 and 6, we have our flying and sea creature, their DNA. And of course, day 6, we have our land animals. And most importantly, we have humans, right? Created on day 6. And we are described distinctly different in Genesis chapter 1. God says that humans are image bearers of the creator God. And we know that humans have unique DNA. And in Genesis 1:27, the Bible goes on to tell us, so God created man in his image. And then it says, he created them, right? Male and females, right? It says, in the image of God, he created them, male and female, he created them. So what we find in our DNA, our DNA is made up into chromosomes, right? Our chromosomes are tightly coiled DNA, and those chromosomes contain genetic information. But there's something called the chromosome pair number 23, and chromosome pair 23 is the biological sex or gender chromosome. And what we see when we look at this is that you are either an XX, which is female, right? Or you're an XY, which is male. So inside, right, every nucleated cell, you have DNA and chromosomal information that's going to reflect a gender that was chosen for you before your mother even knew she was expecting you, right? That was chosen by the creator of the universe. It was there at the moment of fertilization when you were just one single cell. No new genetic information is added after the moment of fertilization. Gender chosen to reflect God's glory. How awesome is that, right? Science always confirms the Bible. And one last example I just love to point out when we talk about DNA is that, we are also one human race. That was one of the conclusions of the Human Genome Project, the 15-year study of DNA, is they confirmed, right, what we're finding out when we look at the human genome is that we're all one human race. And that confirms what we see in Acts 17:26. It says, he made from one man every nation of mankind to live on the face of the earth.
So you have helped students of Master Books to learn this through your resources. So tell us a little bit about that. What grade ranges that you have written for about your books and what they'll do to help these families.
Sure. So my latest resource is The DNA God in You, and it's been out, I think, since January. And it is designed for those kids, I would say upper elementary, middle school. And it's kind of give them that foundation in DNA, but most importantly, from a biblical worldview. And they'll also learn a little bit about genetics as well, and those genetic traits, how they get passed down from our parents. But each of these resources fundamentally is going to point kids to God as the author and designer of the most complex code that has ever been created, and that is the DNA code of life. And when they look at the orderly nature of DNA and they begin to understand and learn the structure of DNA, it's clear this reflects God's orderly universe, right? There is no evidence in the DNA code of life of what we call random chance processes or chaos, right? We see a language. We see an organized code, which can be interpreted for organized information. And I also have another resource, our high school forensic science textbook course. And there's also a video course now that is available. There's a whole chapter, of course, dedicated to DNA. But what's great about this is they're going to get to take it to that next level where they start to understand, well, how do we use DNA in forensic science? Like what's unique about it? What information are we looking at? How do we create that DNA profile? And there's even a little bit about electrophoresis and DNA fingerprinting in the DNA God in You book, but it goes into it in more detail in the forensic science high school course and in the video course of well. But what each of these do is, as I said, God is the, in his creation, it was very good and perfect, and there was no sin. And I think this is what we really need to understand when we talk about forensic science with kids. Because some people ask me, well, why do we even need to study forensic science, right? But we didn't need forensic science before sin. There was no sin, death, disease. There's no suffering. But after Adam and Eve chose to disobey God and bring that into his perfect creation, God knew we were going to disobey him, and he had already put into place those processes, the materials that would be needed, the methods to then solve crimes and bring justice into this broken world until the great judge comes back, right, and restores creation to its perfect order again. I'm just thankful that our Lord and Savior allows us to investigate these and solve these just to help those families that may be victims.
Absolutely. One of my favorite things about Jesus being the light of the world, or the day star, the morning star, is that he exposes the darkness. Mm-hmm. And when we bring him into a situation, we get the light of the world on it. And I've seen the Lord do it for me, and I know that he will do it for everyone who needs forensics, because we do live in a sinful world. We do need people who believe in God to be able to shine the light of truth on a crime, on a situation that the Lord wants to rectify and show himself strong for his people.
And we can point kids back to our Savior and Lord Jesus Christ through all of it, right? And that's what I just love about forensic science. There's also another resource on fingerprints, the work of your hand, which was my expertise in crime scene work. So I love talking about fingerprints as well. And that children's book is available through Master Books. So.
Absolutely. And with your forensics course, that is for 11th and 12th grade. Talk a little bit about
Yes.
why we have made it just for those ages.
Yes, I recommend it for upper high school because it's better if they've had a little bit of biology and chemistry as well, right, leading into that. But still, they just need to be a little bit older. We're talking about forensic science here. So there's going to be topics that may be a little more sensitive that they should be ready for by the time they're that age. And they'll be able to understand it and process it better as well. And the labs are designed for that too, that go along with that course. And I just hope we inspire some kids out there to be scientists because we desperately need Christians in the field of forensic science.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for being who you are, studying what you have, being a part of this generation's opportunity to glorify God in science.
Yeah, and happy DNA Day, everybody. Get out there and enjoy some DNA. Make sure we should mention there's the free PDF download on Master Books' website that has DNA activities, and there is an edible DNA activity in that packet that's a lot of fun. So I encourage you to do that.
Thank you so much, Dr. Rivera. Have
Thanks.
a
See you
great
next
week.
time. Bye.
Bye.